It's Koffi Sessi. I formerly was an employee of Pluralsight. You might have heard of them. Up until 2-3 weeks ago, I worked for Pluralsight. Now I'm working for this small company called Volta Communications, and it is my company. So thank you for coming, and we're here today to talk about audience engagement. Let's start with a question. Why do we perform presentations? Notice I did not say give presentations or do presentation. I say perform presentation, because performance implies practice, implies rehearsal, right? So why do we perform presentations? We do so for one of 4 reasons. Number 1, to entertain. When you get on stage, there is always a little bit of humor. I don't know if you were in Jim Manico's presentation yesterday, but he was trying really, really hard to make people laugh, right? That is part of it. The next one is to inform, right? So we want to share some information that is important that we have that we want to share with the audience. Number 3 is to educate, right? We wanna tell them how to do something, teach them how to do something, to use a new technique, to use a new language, to use what the knowledge we have to do something that's going to help them. And then last but not least is to make a case, is to convince them. I always say that there are 2 reasons to communicate, always. You're selling something or you're buying something. In the broad sense of the term, not in the transactions of it. So now, if we understand that, or we all agree that, to get on stage and speak to people, you must have something very important to say. Why is it that people fall asleep during presentations? Now, what I mean by falling asleep is not literally falling asleep, obviously. It's being disengaged, doing something else while they are in your session. The answer to that has 2 components. One of them is the audience. The other one is you. And today, what I want to do is to give you 5 ways you can use to make sure your audience stays with you through your presentation. So number 1 is the story. I know as developers, you work in a space where facts are king, right? It's cold, it is reason, it's logical, awesome. But here is the reality. Facts are not enough. Facts are just not enough. Nobody goes to the store and stays in the store for 3 days to buy an iPhone because of facts, right? No one does that. Why do we do that? We do that because of emotions. We do that because of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. That's the only reason I will stay in line for 3 days out in the cold to buy a piece of hardware that is going to become obsolete within 12 months, right? So stories are timeless. How many of us remember stories we heard when we were 10 years old? I think everybody in this room can relate to that, because stories carry us far. We remember far more if the information we got is wrapped into a story. Stories are also easy to recall. And most importantly, they're easy to spread. When you hear a story, you don't keep it to yourself, especially if it's funny. You're going to share around the coffee table or around the dinner table to impress your guests, right? So that's the reason anytime you have to go to get in front of somebody, whether it's one person or a room full of people, to tell them or share an information with them, the question you should ask yourself should always be, what is the story, right? What is the story I'm going to tell? That's always where you should start. Now, obviously, number 2, you need to speak the same language as your audience. Why am I saying that? The way you talk to developers is very different from the way you talk to lawyers, right? Who here has not had to explain something to business people? They just don't seem to get it, no matter how hard you try, right? Sometimes you feel like these people are idiots, right? But the reality is they're not idiots. They just don't speak your language. They speak a very different language. In the business world, they are used to things like KPIs and opportunity costs and stuff like that. In your world, you live with frameworks and libraries and APIs, right? There's no connection. So as a presenter, somebody making a case, you need to speak the same language as your audience, right? Now, let me introduce you to a little thing that I call frame of reference. You are going to understand in a minute. When I say Conway's Law, everybody understands what I'm talking about, right? Oh, let me see some heads, right? Okay, so when I say blue pill, red pill, everybody here knows what I'm talking about. I don't have to explain, right? That is the power of frame of reference. Because we all live in the same space, we all have the same bank of knowledge, or knowledge base, if you will. When you tap into what we already know, it's easier to communicate. Does that make sense? Beautiful. Now let's talk about this idea of cognitive load. So what is it that I'm talking about here? I typically equate us, human beings, to computers. Forgive me for doing so. The reason is we have a hardware. Our hardware is our body. And we have a software. It's up here, right? Now, there is a speed at which we can absorb information. Now, if you're trying to teach me or teach me something and you're using the fire hose technique, which means you're just open the valve and sending the information at high velocity speed, there is no way I'm going to be able to capture what you're trying to teach me. So there is a cycle that I refer to as capture, digest, and retain. That is the usual cycle when you're giving information to somebody. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that you should be careful not to create cognitive overload in your audience, right? What does that look like in your world? I'll show you a piece of code. I didn't write that. Martin Fowler did. That's from his book, right? And the code continues on page 2. I don't know about you, but I'm not a developer, by the way, so I have a hard time understanding what exactly I'm looking at. Now, here is the same code in a different form. It's easier to read. I can tell, even with my limited knowledge of development, I can tell what's happening, right? So next time you go to do a presentation, please, please, please do not overload your slide with information, because everybody can read. They can read better than you because you're on stage, they're not. You have the pressure, and they don't have a pressure, so they can read faster than you, right? So they're not there to read, they're there to hear what you have to say. They're there for you. So you have to be there for them. You have to share with them what you're thinking, not ask them to read a slide full of text. All right, the next one is synchronizing your narration with your visuals, right? There is a very good reason PowerPoint was invented in the first place. Because when you're just explaining things to people, yeah, they get it, but it works better when there is a visual to go along with it, right? So this is important because you want to consolidate visually what you're telling them with your words. Does that make sense? So if you are looking to establish or create a strong association between what you're teaching them and what that looks like visually, you're helping them retain. Remember I mentioned earlier the cycle of capture, digest, and retain, right? We go through that every time we're exposed to new information. And if you want them to remember, you need to help them by making sure you're discussing what they see. What's on the slide and what you're talking about have to be in perfect sync. Now, let's talk about delivery for a minute. You've done the work. You spent the time, you did the research. You designed beautiful slides. Everything is just perfect. And you show up, and how do you speak? You start speaking like a robot, and you put people to sleep. This is important enough for you to get on stage to talk about it. it's important enough for you to go through the vetting process. We all know what it takes to get accepted at a conference, right? You're competing with thousands of other people who have as much of a right to be on stage as you do. Now you have to write a proposal, you have to answer a CFP, right? So you go through all that process, right? And then you show up and that's it? No. So you have an instrument. We all have it. That instrument, it's your voice. It's our voice. Your voice is not just an instrument. It has texture. When somebody's tired or when somebody's sad, they don't need to tell you they're sad. You just listen to the sound of their voice and you know, right? How do you know when somebody is scared? They oftentimes don't tell you, oh, I'm scared. No, you hear the sound of their voice and you hear that vibration we're all used to, and then you know this guy is afraid, right? So when you show up and you're full of, your voice is just there, you're full of energy, the audience is going to be with you because your audience wants you always to succeed. They don't want to see you fail. They want you to succeed. So you need to communicate your passion to them, right? You need to get to them. They're there for you, and you need to be there for them. And always make sure that you're delivering with energy. High energy if you can. So let's recap. We've talked about the importance of story. We covered how important it is to speak the language of your audience. We talked about not overloading your PowerPoint slides with a whole bunch of information. We covered narration and visual synchronization, and then we talked about delivery. That should be the end of it. But no, I have one more thing that I want to give you, and it's call to action. So what is call to action really about? I say that as the presenter, when you're on the stage, you're the expert. I don't care if you're speaking to a room full of lawyers or doctors or programmers. When you're on stage, you're the expert. So you spend the last hour giving me this awesome, mind-blowing information or technique or whatever it is that you taught me. So what do I do with it? Right? The essential question we're talking about is, now what? What do I do with the information you've given me? As the presenter, you have to tell your audience what you need them to do with that information. What is the next step? Where should they go next? If they need more information, what should they do? If they want to know exactly how this thing works, is there a place they can go to download your repo? What should they do with the information you just gave them? That is what call to action is all about. As important as all the elements I've mentioned before are, call to action is very, very critical. If you really want your audience to start practicing what you just taught them, call to action is the way to get there. Because if you just give the information and you finish, and the presentation just ended, yeah, they might remember half of what you said after they leave the room. But 3 weeks from now, I bet you anything you want that they may not remember even 10% of what you said. But if you can get them to practice, if you can get them to put what you taught them in action, that makes you stand a chance of having made the impact you wanted to make. Now, as a challenge to you, I'd say when you go in your next presentation, try to see if you can identify the 5 elements we talked about. Because good speakers will have about 3. Great speakers will have about 5 of them. And if you aspire to ever be on a stage, to be giving a keynote, you need to make sure you have all those 5 elements in your talk. Thank you very much.